You're the most powerful person in the known world with unlimited wealth, absolute authority, and the ability to do literally anything you want. And your response is to dress up as a gladiator, wearing nothing but a loincloth, and turn the Roman Colosseum into a giant sex party, fight wild animals in the arena, while demanding that everyone call you Hercules and rename the entire Roman Empire after yourself. Oh, and you also insist that senators pay you millions just to watch you perform badly, choreographed combat routines. This isn't fantasy, this was Tuesday for Emperor Commodus. Tonight we're diving into the absolutely bizarre world of history's most perverted ruler, not to glorify his actions, but to understand how absolute power can corrupt absolutely and create behaviors so strange they make modern celebrity scandals look tame. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe pour yourself something to drink, and let's journey into the mind of a man who turned the entire Roman Empire into his personal playground. Lucius Aurelius Commodus wasn't born evil. He was born into evil, or rather he was born into a system so corrupt and twisted that evil became his normal. The year was 1601 AD, and Rome was at the height of its power under the philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius, a man considered one of history's greatest rulers, but even the best fathers can raise the worst children. Commodus was groomed for power from birth, something that should have been a blessing but turned into a curse that would eventually destroy him and nearly destroy Rome itself. Imagine being told from infancy that you're destined to rule the world, that every person alive exists to serve you, and that your desires, no matter how bizarre or destructive, are more important than the lives of millions of people. This was Commodus's childhood. Marcus Aurelius, despite his wisdom, made a fatal error. He broke with Roman tradition and named his biological son as heir, rather than adopting the most qualified candidate. Previous good emperors had chosen their successors based on merit, but Marcus Aurelius chose blood, and that blood would prove to be poison for the empire. The young Commodus showed disturbing signs early in his development. While other children played with toys, he tortured animals while other boys learned literature and philosophy. He obsessed over gladiatorial combat and violence. His tutors reported that he seemed incapable of empathy and showed an unusual fascination with death and suffering. But these warning signs were ignored or dismissed as boys being boys. His education was the finest money could buy, but Commodus absorbed none of the wisdom his teachers tried to impart. Instead, he learned that he could do whatever he wanted without consequences, that his desires were law, and that other people existed solely for his entertainment. This educational foundation would prove catastrophic when he gained real power. Marcus Aurelius tried to prepare his son for leadership by bringing him along on military campaigns, hoping that exposure to real responsibility would mature him. But instead of learning leadership, Commodus learned that he could order men to die for his amusement, that violence was entertainment, and that power meant never having to consider the consequences of your actions. The relationship between father and son, complex. Marcus Aurelius loved his child, but was increasingly disturbed by his behavior. He tried various methods to instill wisdom and virtue in Commodus, but every attempt failed. The boy seemed immune to moral instruction, and grew more bizarre and cruel with each passing year. When Marcus Aurelius died in 18 AD, he left behind an empire at its peak, and a son who would systematically destroy everything his father had built. Commodus became emperor at age 18, with absolute power, unlimited wealth, and a complete lack of moral restraint. The combination would prove devastating. The early signs of what was to come appeared immediately. Commodus showed no interest in governing or in the welfare of his subjects. Instead, he focused entirely on his own pleasure and entertainment. He began making decisions based not on what was good for Rome, but on what amused him at any given moment. His advisors tried to guide him toward responsible leadership, but Commodus had no patience for advice or criticism. He wanted only sycophants and enablers, people who would encourage his worst impulses and help him indulge every bizarre fantasy that entered his mind. Within months of taking power, Commodus had established patterns of behavior that would define his reign: excess, brutality, narcissism, and a complete disconnection from reality. He lived in a world where his whims were law, where human lives were toys, and where the greatest empire in history existed solely to feed his increasingly twisted appetites. Most Roman emperors viewed gladiatorial games as political tools, ways to keep the masses entertained and maintain their popularity. But for Commodus, the arena became something else entirely, an obsession that consumed his life and transformed him from a ruler into a performer in the most degrading way possible. Commodus didn't just watch gladiator fights, he participated in them, not as a symbolic gesture or occasional display, but as a regular routine that shocked and horrified Roman society. Imagine the President of the United States deciding to become a professional wrestler and demanding that Congress watch him perform every week while paying him millions for the privilege. The emperor would dress in gladiator costumes and fight in carefully staged combat, where his opponents were instructed to lose. He fought against wild animals that had been weakened or drugged to ensure his safety, and he engaged in mock battles where his victory was guaranteed. But he treated these performances as genuine displays of skill and courage. What made this behavior particularly disturbing was that Commodus genuinely believed he was a great warrior. He couldn't distinguish between his staged victories and real combat. He lived in a fantasy world where he was Hercules reborn, a divine hero whose arena performances proved his godlike status. This delusion grew stronger over time until it consumed his entire identity. The cost of these performances was astronomical. Commodus would demand payment for his appearances, charging the Roman treasury millions of sestertii for each performance. He also required that senators and wealthy citizens pay enormous sums just to watch him fight, treating the empire's elite like customers at a very expensive and very bizarre entertainment venue. His obsession with the arena led to increasingly elaborate and costly spectacles. He would stage massive battles involving hundreds of gladiators, wild animal hunts with exotic beasts imported from across the empire, and theatrical performances where he played mythological heroes. These events drained the imperial treasury while serving no purpose beyond feeding his ego. Commodus also began demanding that everyone address him as Hercules, and later as various other mythological figures. He commissioned statues showing himself as these heroes, and required that official documents refer to him by these fantasy names. The Emperor of Rome had essentially become a cosplayer, with unlimited resources and absolute power. The gladiatorial performances became more frequent and more elaborate over time. What started as occasional appearances became weekly shows, then daily performances. Commodus spent more time in the arena than in the palace, more time fighting staged battles than governing the empire. His obsession had completely replaced his responsibilities as ruler. Roman society was horrified by their emperor's behavior. Gladiatorial combat was considered the lowest form of entertainment, suitable only for slaves and criminals. For the emperor to participate was seen as degrading to the office and to Rome itself. But criticism only made Commodus more determined to prove his gladiatorial skills. He began keeping detailed records of his arena victories, claiming to have won over 1,000 fights against men and beasts. These records were obviously fictional since his opponents were required to lose, but Commodus treated them as historical fact and demanded that they be recorded in official histories. The psychological impact of this obsession was profound. Commodus began to see all of life as an arena performance where he was the star and everyone else was either an opponent to defeat or an audience to impress. Real governance became impossible because he couldn't distinguish between ruling an empire and putting on a show. His gladiatorial fantasies also affected his relationships with women and men. He would role-play as various heroes and gods, demanding that his companions participate in elaborate scenarios based on mythology and arena combat. These relationships became performances rather than genuine human connections. The arena obsession revealed the deepest truth about Commodus. He was fundamentally a performer, not a leader, someone who needed constant validation and attention rather than someone capable of the quiet responsibility that good governance required. His reign became one long performance with the Roman Empire as his stage. Commodus didn't just collect power and wealth, He collected people, treating human beings like objects to be acquired, displayed and discarded according to his whims. His approach to relationships was so systematic and dehumanizing that he essentially turned the imperial palace into a catalogue of human specimens. The numbers alone are staggering. Historians record that Commodus maintained 300 male companions and 300 female concubines, a total of 600 people whose entire existence revolved around serving his personal desires. This wasn't just excess, it was a complete reorganization of the imperial household around the emperor's appetites. These weren't relationships in any meaningful sense, they were collections. Commodus would acquire people the way others might collect art or coins, evaluating them based on physical appearance, unusual talents, or simply novelty. Once someone caught his attention, they would be brought to the palace and added to his personal entourage. The selection process was both systematic and bizarre. Commodus would send agents throughout the empire to identify and recruit candidates for his collection. These agents had specific instructions about the types of people the emperor preferred, and they would travel vast distances to find individuals who met his criteria. What made this behavior particularly disturbing was the way Commodus categorized and organized his human collection. He would assign different people to different roles and rotate them according to schedules and preferences, treating intimate relationships like a form of entertainment programming. The psychological impact on the people in his collection was devastating. They lived in luxury, but without freedom or dignity. Their entire existence depended on maintaining the emperor's interest, and they could be discarded, or worse, if they displeased him. The palace became a prison disguised as paradise. Commodus would often display his collection to visitors, treating the people around him like prized possessions to be shown off foreign dignitaries. And Roman nobles would be given tours of the imperial household, where they could observe the emperor's various companions like exhibits in a museum. The emperor also developed elaborate rituals and ceremonies around his relationships, creating performances that combined elements of theater, religion, and personal gratification. These ceremonies were mandatory for court members to attend, turning private matters into public spectacles. His treatment of women was particularly degrading. He would assign them roles based on mythological characters and require them to participate in elaborate fantasies where he played various gods and heroes. These scenarios were performed in front of audiences, turning intimate moments into theatrical productions. The male members of his entourage were similarly objectified and were often required to participate in arena performances alongside the emperor, serving as both companions and gladiatorial performers. This dual role created additional layers of complexity and degradation in their already difficult situations. Commodus would also trade and exchange people with other wealthy Romans, treating human beings like luxury goods to be bartered. The emperor would offer members of his collection as gifts or use them as bargaining chips in political negotiations, reducing people to commodity. The financial cost of maintaining such a large personal entourage was enormous. The palace staff had to accommodate 600 additional residents plus the servants and support staff needed to care for them. The emperor spent vast sums on clothing, jewelry, and entertainment for his collection, while the empire's infrastructure crumbled. Perhaps most disturbing was the way Commodus would punish or dispose of people who no longer interested him. Members of his collection who aged, lost their appeal, or simply fell out of favor, would disappear from the palace, often ending up in slavery or worse. Their very fate served as a constant reminder to others of their precarious position. The emperor's systematic approach to human relationships revealed a complete inability to form genuine connections with other people. He couldn't distinguish between love and possession, between companionship and ownership. His collection was a desperate attempt to fill an emotional void that couldn't be filled through acquisition. Commodus didn't just think he was special, he genuinely believed he was divine, and he used the full power of the Roman Empire to force everyone else to share his delusion. This wasn't simple narcissism, it was a complete break from reality that had devastating consequences for millions of people. The transformation began gradually, with Commodus demanding to be addressed by increasingly grandiose titles. What started as traditional imperial honors evolved into claims of literal godhood. He required people to refer to him as Hercules, then as various other mythological figures, and eventually a living god who deserved worshipped. He commissioned thousands of statues showing himself as Hercules, complete with lion skin and club. These statues were placed throughout the empire, replacing traditional imperial portraits. The message was clear. Commodus was no longer just an emperor. He was a mythological hero, reborn in human form. The emperor began rewriting Roman religion to place himself at the center of worship. He established new festivals celebrating his divine nature and required priests to include prayers to him in religious ceremonies. Traditional Roman gods were demoted to make room for the cult of Commodus. Perhaps most bizarrely, he started renaming everything in the empire after himself. Months of the year were given new names based on his various titles and accomplishments. Rome itself was renamed Commodiana, and he ordered that all records be updated to reflect these changes. The emperor was literally rewriting reality to match his fantasies. His divine delusions affected every aspect of governance. Commodus made political decisions based on what he believed would please the gods, meaning himself rather than what would benefit the empire. He would consult oracles and interpret omens, but always in ways that confirmed his existing desires. The emperor also claimed to have supernatural powers and would stage elaborate demonstrations of his alleged abilities. These performances usually involved carefully orchestrated tricks designed to convince observers that Commodus could perform miracles, but he genuinely believed his own propaganda. Foreign diplomats were required to acknowledge his divine status as part of diplomatic protocol. Treaties and agreements would include clauses recognizing Commodus as a god, and foreign rulers were expected to send tributes acknowledging his supernatural authority. This made international relations extremely difficult. His god complex extended to his physical appearance. Commodus would dress in elaborate costumes representing various deities and mythological figures. He required artists to only depict him in heroic poses, and demanded that all mirrors in the palace be replaced with ones that had been specially crafted to make him appear more impressive. The emperor began holding court while dressed as Jupiter, complete with fake lightning bolts and thunder effects created by hidden servants. He would sit on a throne designed to look like Mount Olympus and require petitioners to approach him as if they were mortals seeking favor from the king of gods. Commodus also developed an elaborate mythology around his own birth and childhood, claiming that his conception involved divine intervention and that his early life had been marked by supernatural signs and portents. These stories were required reading in schools and were incorporated into official Roman history. The financial cost of supporting his god complex was staggering. The emperor spent enormous sums on costumes, prop sets, and special effects for his divine performances. He also paid scholars and artists to create works celebrating his divinity, and hired propagandists to spread stories of his miraculous powers. Perhaps most dangerous was the way his delusions affected his decision-making process. Commodus would make important policy choices based on dreams, visions, and other supposed divine communications that were really just his own subconscious desires projected onto supernatural sources. His divine pretensions also led to increasingly severe punishments for anyone who questioned his status. Doubting the emperor's godhood became treason, and the penalty was death. Many innocent people were executed, simply for failing to show sufficient enthusiasm for his divine claims. The emperor's god complex created a culture of fear and dishonesty throughout the empire. Officials had to pretend to believe his claims while secretly recognizing that their ruler was completely insane. This disconnect between public performance and private reality corrupted the entire governmental system. Commodus didn't just waste money. He systematically destroyed the Roman economy through a combination of megalomaniacal spending, personal greed, and complete ignorance of how finances actually work. His reign turned the world's wealthiest empire into a fiscal disaster that took generations to repair. The arena obsession alone cost the empire astronomical sums. Each gladiatorial performance required enormous expenditures for exotic animals, elaborate sets, and payment to the emperor himself, who charged the treasury for his appearances. A single day's entertainment might cost more than some provinces collected in taxes for an entire year. His collection of 600 personal companions required a complete reconstruction of the imperial palace to accommodate their needs, plus ongoing expenses for food, clothing, entertainment, and servants. The emperor essentially maintained a small city within the palace, dedicated solely to his personal pleasure. The cost of his divine pretensions was equally devastating. Commodus commissioned thousands of statues, temples, and monuments celebrating his alleged godhood. These projects served no practical purpose but required vast amounts of precious metals, skilled labor, and imported materials. Perhaps most destructively, the emperor began selling government positions to the highest bidders. Rather than appointing qualified candidates, anyone with enough money could purchase important offices, including judgeships, military commands, and governorships. This system corrupted the entire imperial administration, while generating short-term revenue for the emperor's personal spending. Commodus also manipulated the currency to fund his excesses. He reduced the silver content of coins while maintaining their face value, essentially creating inflation that impoverished ordinary Romans, while providing him with precious metals to fund his lifestyle. This monetary manipulation undermined trade and commerce throughout the empire. The emperor's paranoia led to massive expenditures on security and surveillance. He employed thousands of spies, informants, and bodyguards, creating a vast secret police apparatus that consumed enormous resources while terrorizing the population. The cost of maintaining this security state was astronomical. His building projects were designed more for spectacle than utility. Commodus constructed elaborate pleasure palaces, amphitheaters, and monuments that served his ego rather than practical needs. These projects required enormous expenditures while producing no economic benefit for the empire. The emperor also manipulated the grain supply system that fed Rome's population, rather than ensuring adequate food distribution. He would create artificial shortages to increase prices, then profit from selling grain at inflated rates. This system threatened the basic food security of the imperial capital. His treatment of the wealthy was particularly destructive. Commodus would identify rich Romans, then create false charges against them, allowing him to confiscate their property while eliminating potential rivals. This system encouraged the wealthy to flee the empire, taking their capital, expertise with them. The emperor's foreign policy was equally expensive and pointless. He would launch military campaigns not for strategic reasons but for personal glory. These wars consumed vast resources while achieving no meaningful objectives, and often made Rome's enemies stronger. Perhaps most bizarrely, Commodus began charging admission for people to meet with him, turning imperial audiences into paid performances. Senators, foreign diplomats, and provincial governors had to pay enormous fees just to conduct official business with their emperor. His taxation policies were designed to maximize short-term revenue rather than promote long-term economic growth. He would impose heavy taxes on productive activities while exempting his favorites and supporters. This system discouraged commerce and industry while encouraging corruption. The emperor also manipulated inheritance laws to benefit himself, changing the rules to allow him to claim portions of wealthy Romans' estates. This system undermined property rights and discouraged long-term investment and planning. His monetary policies created severe inflation that hurt ordinary Romans while benefiting debtors, including the emperor himself. The purchasing power of Roman currency declined dramatically during his reign, impoverishing everyone except those with access to alternative stores of value. Trade relationships with foreign powers deteriorated as other nations lost confidence in Roman currency and questioned the empire's stability. Under such erratic leadership, this isolation hurt Roman commerce and reduced the flow of luxury goods and raw material. The emperor's financial mismanagement created a cycle of crisis and desperate measures. Each new fiscal emergency led to more extreme policies, which created new problems requiring even more extreme solutions. The empire became trapped in a downward spiral of economic destruction. By the end of his reign, Commodus had transformed Rome from the world's wealthiest empire into a financial basket case. His successors would spend decades trying to repair the damage, while the empire never fully recovered the economic strength it had possessed before his rule. As Commodus's delusions grew stronger, so did his paranoia, creating a reign of terror that made life in the Roman Empire a constant gamble with death. The emperor saw enemies everywhere, and his responses to imagined threats were so extreme that they created the very opposition he feared. Emperor's security apparatus was vast and intrusive. He employed thousands of spies who reported on the activities, conversations, and even thoughts of Roman citizens. These informants operated at every level of society, from palace servants to provincial governors, creating an atmosphere where no one could trust anyone. Accusations of treason became weapons that could be used against anyone who displeased the emperor or his favorites. The definition of treason expanded to include almost any criticism of Commodus, his policies, or his divine claims. Even private conversations could result in death sentences if reported by informants. The emperor's trials were theatrical performances rather than judicial proceedings. The outcome was always predetermined, and the process was designed more for entertainment than justice. Accused individuals would be forced to perform humiliating acts before their execution, turning their deaths into spectacles for the emperor's amusement. Commodus developed an elaborate system of punishments that reflected his twisted psychology. Rather than simply executing his enemies, he would devise creative torments that satisfied his need for drama and control. The punishments were often public events that served as warnings to potential opponents. His paranoia extended to his own family and closest associates. Anyone who showed signs of independence or competence became a potential threat. Several family members were executed on trumped-up charges, while trusted advisors would suddenly find themselves accused of conspiracy. The emperor's fear of assassination led to extreme security measures that isolated him from reality. He would change his schedule randomly, sleep in different locations, and require multiple food tasters for every meal. These precautions made normal governance impossible, while increasing his sense of persecuted. His treatment of the Roman Senate was particularly cruel. Senators were required to attend humiliating ceremonies where they would be forced to acknowledge his divine status, make payments for his arena performances, and participate in degrading rituals that stripped them of dignity and authority. Commodus would also stage fake assassination attempts to justify crackdowns on his enemies. These manufactured conspiracies allowed him to eliminate opponents while appearing to respond to genuine threats. The emperor became expert at creating the very dangers he claimed to be fighting. His paranoia made him increasingly unpredictable. Officials never knew what might trigger his anger or suspicion. This uncertainty paralyzed the government as administrators became afraid to make decisions that might be interpreted as threatening to the emperor. The economic costs of his security state were enormous. The emperor spent vast sums on bodyguards, informants, and surveillance equipment, while also paying bribes to maintain loyalty among his supporters. These expenditures diverted resources from productive uses while creating a culture of corruption. His fear of plots led to constant purges of the military officer corps. Commodus would remove experienced commanders and replace them with incompetent favorites whose main qualification was personal loyalty to him. This policy weakened Rome's military capabilities while creating instability in frontier regions. The emperor's paranoia also affected his relationships with foreign powers. He would interpret routine diplomatic communications as threats and respond with disproportionate military action. This behavior made other nations reluctant to deal with Rome and increased the likelihood of actual conflict. His treatment of intellectuals and artists was particularly destructive. Anyone whose work might be interpreted as critical of the emperor or his policies faced persecution. Writers, historians, and philosophers either fled the empire or produced only propaganda that praised Commodus. The emperor's paranoia created a feedback loop, where his extreme responses to imagined threats created real opposition, which justified even more extreme measures. This cycle of fear and repression gradually destroyed the social fabric that held the empire together. Perhaps most tragically, his reign of terror eliminated many of Rome's most capable administrators, generals, and thinkers. The empire lost an entire generation of leadership, while surviving officials learned that competence and honesty were dangerous qualities that attracted unwanted attention. Commodus approached human relationships with the same systematic excess that characterized every other aspect of his reign, transforming intimate connections into elaborate performances that satisfied his need for control, rather than genuine human connection. His appetites were less about physical desire than about power and domination. The emperor's approach to romance was fundamentally theatrical. He would create elaborate scenarios based on mythology, where he played gods and heroes while his companions were assigned roles as goddesses, nymphs, or other mythological figures. These performances were mandatory and often conducted in front of audiences. His collection of companions was organized like a military unit, with hierarchies, responsibilities, and rotation schedules. People were assigned specific days and times to spend with the emperor, and were required to maintain themselves according to his exacting standards. This systematization removed any spontaneity or genuine emotion from relationships. Commodus would also stage elaborate wedding ceremonies, where he would symbolically marry different companions in elaborate rituals that combined elements of theater, religion, and personal fantasy. These ceremonies served no legal purpose but satisfied his need to dominate and possess the people around him. His relationships were characterized by extreme possessiveness. Once someone became part of his collection, they lost all freedom to make independent choices about their lives, careers, or other relationships. The emperor demanded absolute loyalty and exclusive attention from his companions. Emperor's appetite extended beyond his personal collection, to include demands on the wives and family members of Roman nobles. He would require aristocratic families to provide members for his entertainment, creating a system that essentially institutionalized violation of traditional Roman families. His sexual theater often involved elaborate costumes, sets, and props that recreated mythological scenes or historical events. These performances required extensive preparation and rehearsal, turning intimate moments into exhausting productions that served the emperor's fantasies rather than any genuine desires. Commodus also used relationships as weapons against his political enemies. He would target the family members of people he disliked, using his power to force them into his collection as a form of humiliation and control. This behavior created additional enemies while demonstrating his complete lack of respect for traditional Roman values. His approach to masculinity was equally performative. He would engage in exaggerated displays of physical prowess and dominance that were designed more to impress observers than to satisfy any genuine desires. The emperor's sexuality became another arena for his constant need to prove his superiority. The psychological impact on his companions was severe. Many developed what we would now recognize as symptoms of trauma, including depression, anxiety, and various physical ailments caused by the stress of their situation. The palace became filled with people who lived in constant fear despite their luxurious surroundings. His demands for novelty meant that he was constantly seeking new experiences and new people to add to his collection. This created a culture of competition among his companions who had to constantly prove their worth to maintain their positions. The emperor's sexual appetites also influenced his policy decisions. He would make political appointments based on his personal relationships rather than qualifications, leading to widespread corruption and incompetence in government positions. His treatment of children was particularly disturbing. He would identify young people throughout the empire who met his criteria and arrange for them to be brought to the palace, where they would be groomed for future inclusion in his collection. The financial costs of supporting his elaborate sexual theater were enormous. The emperor spent vast sums on costumes, sets, entertainment, and gifts for his companions, while also maintaining a large staff of servants, designers, and coordinators to organize his performances. His sexual excess also created security problems, as the large number of people with intimate access to the emperor presented numerous opportunities for assassination attempts. This led to even more elaborate security measures that further isolated him from reality. The emperor's approach to relationships revealed his fundamental inability to distinguish between love and possession, between intimacy and performance. His sexuality became another expression of his need to control and dominate, rather than any genuine desire for human connection. Under Commodus, the Roman government transformed from an efficient administrative machine into a chaotic theater troupe, where competence was punished, incompetence was rewarded, and every decision was made to satisfy the emperor's whims rather than serve the empire's needs. The emperor's approach to appointments was based entirely on personal criteria rather than qualifications. He would select governors based on their physical appearance, military commanders based on their arena skills, and judges based on their willingness to participate in his mythological performances. His cabinet meetings were elaborate theatrical productions where officials were required to dress as mythological figures and conduct government business while playing assigned roles. Ministers might be required to portray gods or heroes while discussing tax policy or military strategy. The emperor would make major policy decisions based on dreams, omens, or the outcomes of gladiatorial contests rather than careful analysis of facts and consequences. This approach made long-term planning impossible and created constant uncertainty throughout the government. His attention span for administrative work was extremely limited. He would lose interest in important matters after a few minutes and delegate critical decisions to whoever happened to be present at the time. This led to wildly inconsistent policies and frequent reversals of previous decisions. Commodus developed an elaborate system of titles and honors that reflected his mythological obsessions rather than administrative needs. Officials might be appointed as High Priest of Hercules or Divine Champion of the Arena while having no relevant qualifications for actual government work. His treatment of the Roman Senate was particularly destructive. He would require senators to pay enormous fees to attend meetings, then force them to participate in humiliating ceremonies that had nothing to do with actual governance. The Senate became a theatrical troupe rather than a legislative body. The emperor's paperwork was often ignored for weeks or months while he focused on arena performances and personal entertainment. Important decisions would be delayed indefinitely while the emperor pursued his various obsessions, leaving the empire without effective leadership. His approach to justice was equally chaotic. He would personally oversee trials and make decisions based on his mood rather than evidence or law. Criminals might be released if they entertained him, while innocent people could be executed for failing to show sufficient enthusiasm for his performances. The emperor's foreign policy was conducted through theatrical gestures rather than diplomatic strategy. He would send ambassadors dressed as mythological figures to foreign courts and expect other rulers to participate in his fantasy scenario. His military appointments were based on loyalty and entertainment value rather than tactical skill. He promoted gladiators to command positions while demoting experienced officers who questioned his strategies. This policy weakened Rome's military effectiveness and endangered frontier security. The emperor would also reorganize government departments based on his current interests, creating new bureaucracies to manage his arena performances while eliminating offices responsible for essential services like infrastructure maintenance and tax collection. His system of rewards and punishments was completely arbitrary. Officials never knew what behavior would please or anger the emperor, making it impossible to develop consistent policies or maintain effective working relationship. The emperor's demands for constant entertainment meant that government officials spent more time organizing spectacles than governing the empire. Administrative work was viewed as secondary to satisfying the emperor's need for amusement. His approach to law enforcement was equally chaotic. He would create new crimes based on his personal dislikes while ignoring traditional offenses that didn't interest him. The legal system became unpredictable and corrupt, as judges tried to anticipate what would please the emperor. The emperor's financial management was characterized by complete ignorance of basic economics. He would make spending decisions based on immediate desires rather than long-term consequences, leading to budget crises that paralyzed government operation. His personnel policies created a culture of fear and dishonesty, where competent officials learned to hide their abilities to avoid unwanted attention, while incompetent sycophants rose to positions of authority based on their willingness to flatter the emperor. The emperor's record-keeping was equally chaotic. He would order documents destroyed or altered to match his current fantasies, while creating elaborate fictional records of his achievements. This approach made it impossible to maintain accurate information about the empire's finances, population, or military strength. Perhaps most destructively, his administrative chaos created a precedent for future emperors who learned that governance was optional, as long as they could maintain control through fear and spectacle. The Roman system never fully recovered from the damage he inflicted on its institutional foundation. Commodus didn't just claim to be divine, he systematically restructured Roman religion to make himself the central figure of worship, transforming the empire's spiritual life into an elaborate cult of personality that corrupted traditional beliefs and practices. The emperor began by inserting himself into existing religious ceremonies, requiring priests to include prayers and offerings to him alongside traditional gods. This gradual infiltration made his divine claims seem like natural extensions of established religion rather than revolutionary changes. He commissioned new temples dedicated to his worship, often built on sites previously sacred to other gods. These temples featured elaborate statues showing Commodus in various divine poses, while priests conducted ceremonies that combined traditional rituals with worship of the living emperor. His religious innovations included new festivals celebrating his achievements and divine nature. These celebrations were mandatory throughout the empire and featured performances reenacting his arena victories, mythological adventures, and alleged miraculous powers. The emperor also created new religious orders dedicated to his worship. These priesthoods were well-funded positions that attracted ambitious individuals who were willing to promote his divine claims in exchange for wealth and status. The new priests often had more political influence than traditional religious authorities. Commodus began rewriting traditional myths to include himself as a central figure. He claimed to be the reincarnation of Hercules, but also inserted himself into stories about other gods and heroes, creating a complex mythology where he was the most important divine being. His religious policies extended to requiring foreign visitors and diplomats to acknowledge his divine status as part of diplomatic protocol. Treaties and trade agreements included clauses recognizing Commodus as a god. While foreign rulers were expected to send religious tributes, the emperor's approach to traditional Roman gods was inconsistent. He would sometimes claim to be their equal, sometimes their superior, and sometimes their chosen representative on earth. This flexibility allowed him to adapt his religious claims to whatever situation served his immediate purposes. His religious theater included elaborate ceremonies, where he would appear dressed as various gods, complete with special effects created by hidden servants. These performances combined elements of theater, religion, and propaganda to create convincing displays of supernatural power. The emperor also claimed to receive divine communications through dreams, visions, and oracles that mysteriously always confirmed his existing desires. These alleged supernatural messages were used to justify policy decisions and eliminate opposition, while appearing to follow divine guidance. His religious innovations had serious economic consequences. Building new temples, funding new priesthoods, and organizing elaborate festivals consumed vast resources, while traditional religious institutions lost funding and influence as resources were redirected to the cult of Commodus. The emperor's religious policies created divisions within Roman society, between those who genuinely believed his claims, those who pretended to believe for political reasons, and those who secretly opposed his religious revolution. These divisions weakened social cohesion and created ongoing conflict. His treatment of traditional priests was particularly manipulative. He would offer them wealth and status if they supported his divine claims, while threatening those who maintained traditional beliefs. This approach corrupted religious leadership while creating uncertainty about authentic spiritual authority. The emperor's religious policies also affected military morale, as soldiers were required to swear oaths to his divine nature and participate in religious ceremonies honoring him. These requirements created conflicts for soldiers who maintained traditional beliefs while weakening unit cohesion. His approach to death and afterlife was equally self-serving. He claimed that worshipping him would guarantee favorable treatment in the afterlife, while opposing him would result in eternal punishment. These threats and promises gave his religious claims practical consequences that encouraged compliance. The emperor's religious innovations influenced art and literature, as artists and writers were required to create works celebrating his divine nature, while avoiding themes that might contradict his religious claims. This censorship impoverished Roman culture, while creating a vast propaganda apparatus. His religious policies also affected education, as schools were required to teach his mythology and divine claims alongside traditional subjects. Children learned that Commodus was a god before they learned about traditional Roman history or culture. Perhaps most dangerously, his religious revolution established precedents for future emperors who learned that claiming divine status was an effective way to silence opposition and control the population. His innovations poisoned Roman religion for generations. The emperor's religious policies revealed his fundamental understanding that controlling people's spiritual beliefs was more effective than controlling their actions by making himself the object of religious devotion. He ensured that opposition to his rule became not just political dissent but religious heresy. The Roman military from a professional fighting force into an entertainment troupe that served his personal fantasies rather than defending the empire. His approach to military affairs was so destructive that it compromised Rome's security while demoralizing the troops who had previously been the backbone of imperial power. The emperor's military appointments were based on personal loyalty and entertainment value rather than tactical competence. He promoted gladiators to command positions while demoting experienced officers who questioned his unconventional strategies. This policy placed incompetent commanders in charge of veteran troops. His approach to military ceremonies was particularly bizarre. He would require soldiers to participate in elaborate theatrical performances where they played mythological figures while conducting routine military business. Troops were expected to dress as heroes and gods during inspections and parades. The emperor would personally lead military exercises that were choreographed like arena performances rather than practical training sessions. Soldiers were required to stage battles where Commodus always won, while learning tactics that had more to do with entertainment than actual combat effectiveness. His treatment of military traditions was equally destructive. He would change established procedures and protocols to match his current interests, replacing time-tested methods with innovations that served his ego, rather than military effectiveness. Veteran soldiers watched centuries of professional knowledge being discarded. Commodus also used the military as a source of recruits for his personal entertainment. He would identify soldiers who met his physical criteria and transfer them to palace duty, where they served as gladiatorial performers rather than professional warriors. This practice weakened military units while corrupting military culture. His approach to frontier defense was characterized by neglect and incompetence. He showed little interest in border security or strategic planning, preferring to focus on domestic performances, while barbarian tribes began testing Roman defenses and finding them inadequate. The emperor's military spending priorities were completely backwards. He would lavish enormous sums on ceremonial equipment and theatrical props, while neglecting basic supplies like weapons, armor, and food for troops. His budget allocated more money for costumes than for military engineering. His treatment of military victories was equally problematic. He would claim credit for successes achieved by his generals, while blaming them for any failures that occurred. This approach demoralized competent commanders, while encouraging them to avoid taking initiative or making difficult decisions. The emperor's personal participation in military campaigns was a disaster for morale and effectiveness. He would insist on leading troops while dressed as Hercules, complete with lion skin and club, expecting soldiers to treat him as a mythological hero rather than their commander. His strategic thinking was influenced more by arena combat than actual military tactics. He would plan campaigns like gladiatorial performances with elaborate staging and predetermined outcomes rather than adapting to real battlefield conditions. This approach led to several embarrassing defeats. The emperor's treatment of military prisoners reflected his twisted psychology, rather than following established protocols for handling captives. He would force them to participate in gladiatorial contests or mythological performances before deciding their fate. His approach to military intelligence was equally chaotic. He would ignore reports that contradicted his preconceptions while accepting obviously false information that confirmed his beliefs. This selective attention to facts made strategic planning impossible and left Roman forces vulnerable to surprise attacks. Commodus also corrupted military discipline by creating special privileges for troops who participated in his entertainment projects. Soldiers who performed well in arena shows received better treatment than those who excelled in actual military duties. This policy reversed traditional military values. His neglect of frontier fortifications was particularly dangerous. He would redirect funds allocated for war maintenance and garrison supplies to pay for his personal entertainment, while barbarian tribes observed the deteriorating state of Roman defenses. The emperor's approach to military logistics was characterized by complete ignorance of practical requirements. He would order campaigns without ensuring adequate supplies or transportation, while expecting troops to somehow manage without proper support. His treatment of veteran soldiers was especially demoralizing. Experienced troops who had served the empire faithfully for decades found themselves commanded by former gladiators and forced to participate in theatrical performances rather than using their professional skills. The emperor's military policies also affected recruitment, as potential soldiers learned that military service under Commodus meant participating in degrading entertainment rather than honorable defense of the empire. Many young men sought alternative careers rather than join such a corrupted institution. His approach to allied forces was equally destructive. He would require foreign troops to acknowledge his divine status and participate in his mythological performances, creating resentment among peoples who had previously been loyal to Rome. The emperor's military reforms were based on personal whims rather than strategic analysis. He would reorganize entire legions to create more opportunities for theatrical performances, while ignoring the tactical advantages of traditional military structures. His treatment of military engineering was particularly short-sighted. He would cancel important infrastructure projects like roads, bridges, and fortifications to fund his entertainment, while making it increasingly difficult for troops to move and supply themselves effectively. Perhaps most dangerously, his military policies established precedents that weakened Roman military culture for generations. Future emperors learned that the army could be treated as a source of entertainment rather than a professional fighting force. The psychological impact on military morale was devastating. Soldiers who had joined to serve Rome with honor found themselves forced to participate in humiliating performances while watching their institution being systematically corrupted. His approach to military justice was equally arbitrary. He would punish or reward soldiers based on their entertainment value rather than their military performance, creating a system where competence was less important than the ability to amuse the emperor. The emperor's military legacy was one of systematic destruction of everything that had made Roman forces effective. His reign marked the beginning of a decline in military professionalism that would contribute to the empire's eventual collapse. Commodus systematically corrupted Roman cultural life, transforming art, literature, and intellectual pursuits into vehicles for his personal propaganda, while destroying centuries of artistic and scholarly achievement through his demands for constant flattery and mythological fantasies. The emperor's approach to patronage was entirely self-serving. He would only fund artists and writers who created works celebrating his divine nature and arena achievements, while cutting support for traditional cultural institutions that didn't serve his immediate interests. His artistic commissions were characterized by bizarre requirements. Artists were instructed to depict him as various gods and mythological heroes, often in anatomically impossible poses that emphasized his alleged supernatural powers. These works had no artistic merit, but served his need for constant validation. The emperor's treatment of literature was equally destructive. He would ban books that didn't mention him favorably, while requiring authors to include references to his divine nature in all new works. This censorship impoverished Roman intellectual life, while creating a vast propaganda library. His approach to historical records was particularly damaging. He would order official histories to be rewritten to emphasize his achievements, while minimizing or eliminating references to previous emperors. This systematic falsification made it impossible for future generations to understand their own past. Commodus also corrupted educational institutions by requiring schools to teach his mythology alongside traditional subjects. Children learned that he was Hercules reborn before they learned basic mathematics or reading, creating a generation that couldn't distinguish between fantasy and reality. His treatment of philosophers and intellectuals was characterized by suspicion and hostility. Anyone whose work might be interpreted as criticism of his rule faced persecution, while only sycophantic scholars who praised his wisdom received imperial support. The emperor's approach to public entertainment was equally corrupting. He would require theaters to perform plays celebrating his achievements while banning works that didn't feature him prominently. This censorship eliminated most traditional Roman drama while creating a new genre of imperial propaganda. His artistic taste was limited to works that featured him as the central figure. He commissioned thousands of statues, paintings, and mosaics showing himself in various heroic poses, while showing no interest in art that didn't serve his ego. The emperor's treatment of foreign cultural influences was inconsistent. He would embrace exotic artistic styles if they could be adapted to glorify him, while rejecting traditional Roman cultural values that emphasized virtue and public service. His approach to religious art was particularly manipulative. He would commission works that blended traditional religious imagery with his own features, creating pieces that subtly suggested his divine nature while appearing to honor established gods. The emperor's cultural policies had severe economic consequences, supporting his vast propaganda apparatus, consumed resources that might have been used to maintain libraries, schools, and other cultural institutions, while traditional patronage systems collapsed. His treatment of cultural festivals was equally self-serving. He would transform traditional celebrations into events focused on his achievements while eliminating aspects that didn't serve his interests. These changes destroyed the social and religious functions that festivals had traditionally served. The emperor's approach to music was limited to compositions that celebrated his arena victories and divine status. He would commission elaborate musical works for his performances, while showing no interest in traditional Roman musical culture. His influence on architecture was characterized by megalomania. He would order the construction of enormous monuments to himself, while neglecting infrastructure projects that would have benefited ordinary Romans. These buildings served no practical purpose beyond feeding his ego. The emperor's cultural policies created a feedback loop where artists and intellectuals learned that success required abandoning their principles and creativity in favor of producing formulaic propaganda. This corruption eliminated an entire generation of potential cultural achievement. His treatment of cultural criticism was particularly intolerant. Anyone who suggested improvements to his artistic projects or questioned his cultural innovations faced punishment, while only uncritical praise was rewarded. The emperor's approach to cultural exchange with other civilizations was limited to importing exotic materials and techniques that could be used to create more impressive propaganda, while showing no interest in genuine intellectual or artistic dialogue. His cultural legacy was one of systematic destruction of everything that had made Roman civilization great. His reign marked a turning point where cultural achievement became secondary to political flattery. The psychological impact on artists and intellectuals was severe. Many fled the empire rather than compromise their integrity, while others abandoned their vocations entirely rather than produce propaganda. His approach to preserving cultural artifacts was characterized by neglect and destruction. He would order the melting down of precious artworks to fund his entertainment, while allowing libraries and museums to deteriorate. Perhaps most tragically, his cultural policies eliminated much of the intellectual foundation that had supported Roman civilization, creating gaps in knowledge and understanding that took centuries to repair. Commodus transformed Roman foreign relations from sophisticated diplomatic engagement into a series of embarrassing spectacles that damaged the empire's reputation, while creating enemies and undermining alliances that had taken generations to build. His approach to diplomatic protocol required foreign ambassadors to acknowledge his divine status and participate in his mythological performances before conducting any official business. This bizarre requirement insulted foreign rulers while making normal diplomatic relations impossible. The emperor would receive foreign dignitaries while dressed as various gods, often requiring them to address him by mythological names rather than imperial titles. This behavior convinced other nations that Rome was ruled by a madman. His treatment of international treaties was equally problematic. He would insist on including clauses recognizing his divine nature in all agreements, while demanding that foreign rulers send religious tributes acknowledging his supernatural status. The emperor's approach to international trade was characterized by megalomania. He would demand that foreign merchants pay special fees to trade with his divine empire, while requiring them to participate in ceremonies honoring his achievement. His military campaigns against foreign enemies were planned more like arena performances than actual warfare. He would insist on personally leading troops while dressed as Hercules, expecting foreign opponents to recognize his mythological status. The emperor's treatment of foreign hostages and prisoners reflected his twisted psychology. He would force them to participate in gladiatorial contests or mythological performances rather than following established diplomatic protocols for their treatment. His approach to international intelligence was equally chaotic. He would ignore accurate reports about foreign threats while accepting obviously false information that confirmed his beliefs about his own importance. The emperor's demands for international recognition of his divine status created problems throughout the Mediterranean world. Rulers who had previously been allies began questioning their relationships with an empire led by someone so obviously unstable. His treatment of foreign cultural delegations was particularly embarrassing. He would require visiting artists, scholars, and religious leaders to participate in ceremonies celebrating his achievements while showing no interest in genuine cultural exchange. The emperor's approach to international law was characterized by arbitrary demands. He would expect other nations to modify their legal systems to accommodate his religious claims, while threatening military action against those who refused. His diplomatic correspondence was filled with references to his mythological adventures and divine powers, creating documents that foreign rulers found either amusing or alarming, depending on their perspective. The emperor's treatment of international marriages and family alliances was equally destructive. He would break traditional agreements while demanding that foreign nobility provide family members for his personal entertainment. His approach to international religious relations was particularly offensive. He would require foreign priests and religious leaders to acknowledge his divine status while showing disrespect for their traditional beliefs and practices. The emperor's military threats against foreign powers were often based on perceived slights to his divine dignity, rather than actual strategic interests. This unpredictability made other nations reluctant to engage in normal diplomatic relation. His treatment of international merchants and travelers was characterized by arbitrary demands and humiliating requirements that discouraged trade and cultural exchange, while damaging Rome's reputation as a civilized nation. The emperor's approach to frontier management was equally problematic. He would neglect border security while focusing on domestic entertainment, allowing barbarian tribes to observe Roman weakness and plan their own military actions. His diplomatic gifts to foreign rulers often consisted of items related to his arena performances or divine claims rather than traditional symbols of respect and alliance. These inappropriate presents insulted recipients while revealing his disconnection from diplomatic norms. The emperor's treatment of international visitors to Rome was particularly embarrassing. He would require them to attend his gladiatorial performances and pay tribute to his divine nature, while providing no genuine hospitality or meaningful engagement. His approach to international crises was characterized by theatrical gestures rather than practical solutions. He would respond to serious diplomatic challenges with elaborate performances that addressed his ego rather than the underlying problems. The emperor's international legacy was one of systematic destruction of Rome's diplomatic relationships and reputation. His reign marked a turning point, where other nations began to see the empire as unpredictable and dangerous, rather than powerful and reliable. The psychological impact on Roman diplomats was severe. Many experienced ambassadors requested reassignment rather than represent such an embarrassing ruler, while others simply refused to carry out their duty. His approach to international propaganda was limited to promoting his personal mythology, rather than advancing Roman interests. Foreign nations learned more about his alleged divine powers than about actual Roman policies or capability. Perhaps most dangerously, his diplomatic failures created strategic vulnerabilities that would be exploited by foreign enemies for generations. The relationships he destroyed took decades to rebuild. While some alliances were permanently lost, life inside the imperial palace under Commodus was a bizarre combination of luxury and terror, where inhabitants lived in constant fear. Despite being surrounded by unimaginable wealth and comfort, the emperor transformed his residence into a stage for his fantasies, while creating an environment that was psychologically toxic for everyone involved. The physical palace was constantly being remodeled to accommodate the emperor's changing obsessions. Rooms would be redesigned to look like mythological settings, arena training facilities, or elaborate theaters depending on his current interests. This constant construction created noise, dust, and chaos throughout the building. Palace staff lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, never knowing what bizarre demands or violent outbursts they might face from one moment to the next. Servants could be rewarded with gold for performing well in one of his theatrical productions, or executed for failing to show sufficient enthusiasm. His daily schedule was completely unpredictable. He might decide to hold gladiatorial training sessions at midnight, require palace inhabitants to participate in elaborate mythological performances at dawn, or demand that everyone attend his divine ceremonies at random times throughout the day. The emperor's meals were elaborate theatrical productions, where food was served by people dressed as mythological figures, while he ate while dressed as various gods. These dining experiences lasted for hours, and often included performances by his collection of companions. His sleeping arrangements were equally bizarre. He would rotate between different bedrooms, each decorated to represent different mythological settings, while requiring various companions to participate in elaborate bedtime rituals that combined elements of worship and entertainment. Palace security was extreme and intrusive. Everyone inside was constantly watched by multiple layers of guards and informants who reported on conversations, behavior, and even facial expressions. The atmosphere of surveillance made genuine relationships impossible. The Emperor's bath time was a major production that required dozens of servants and elaborate preparations, including special costumes for attendants, theatrical props, and sometimes live musical accompaniment. These daily events could last for hours. His approach to palace etiquette required everyone to address him by whatever mythological name he was using that day, while following complex protocols that changed regularly based on his current fantasies. Staff had to memorize new rules constantly. The Emperor's treatment of palace animals was equally bizarre. He kept exotic beasts that he would use in his arena performances while also maintaining collections of animals that represented various mythological creatures. These animals were often dangerous and poorly maintained. His approach to palace entertainment required inhabitants to be constantly ready to perform at a moment's notice. Everyone from high-ranking officials to kitchen servants might be called upon to participate in impromptu theatrical production. The psychological toll on palace inhabitants was severe. Many developed what we would now recognize as trauma symptoms, including depression, anxiety, and various stress-related physical ailments, while being unable to seek help or escape their situation. His treatment of palace children was particularly disturbing. Young people who lived in the palace were groomed from early ages to participate in his performances, while being exposed to adult content and situations that were inappropriate for their development. The Emperor's approach to palace finances was characterized by extreme waste. He would spend enormous sums on unnecessary luxuries and theatrical props while neglecting basic maintenance and staff welfare. His demands for palace staff to participate in his religious ceremonies created additional stress for people who maintained traditional beliefs but were required to worship him as a living god. The Emperor's treatment of sick or injured palace inhabitants was inconsistent. He might provide elaborate medical care for people who amused him while ignoring the suffering of those who had fallen out of favor. His approach to palace discipline was arbitrary, and severe staff could be punished harshly for minor infractions, while serious problems might be ignored if they didn't interfere with his entertainment. The physical toll of palace life was significant. Inhabitants were required to maintain their appearance according to his exacting standards, while participating in demanding physical performances that often resulted in injuries. His treatment of palace visitors was equally unpredictable. Guests might be honored with elaborate ceremonies or subjected to humiliating treatments, depending on his mood and their perceived usefulness for his entertainment. The Emperor's approach to palace education required tutors and scholars to focus entirely on his mythology and achievements, while neglecting traditional subjects. This created an environment where learning was impossible. Perhaps most disturbing was the way palace life normalized extreme behavior. Inhabitants gradually adapted to increasingly bizarre and harmful situations, until they could no longer recognize how abnormal their environment had become. The isolation of palace life made it impossible for inhabitants to maintain perspective on their situation. They were cut off from normal society while being immersed in the Emperor's fantasy world. His approach to palace communications was characterized by paranoia, and control. Information was strictly managed while inhabitants were prohibited from maintaining outside relationships that might influence their loyalty. The long-term psychological damage to palace survivors was severe. Many never recovered from their experiences, while others spent years trying to readjust to normal life after escaping or being released from the Emperor's service. By the end of his reign, Commodus had completely lost touch with reality, living in a fantasy world so elaborate and disconnected from facts that his decisions became increasingly dangerous, not just for himself but for the entire empire. His final years were characterized by escalating paranoia, bizarre behavior, and decisions that defied all logic. The Emperor's grip on reality became so tenuous that he could no longer distinguish between his theatrical performances and actual events. He genuinely believed that his staged gladiatorial victories were real combat, while treating his mythological role-playing as historical fact. His paranoia reached such extreme levels that he saw assassination plots everywhere. Often in situations that were clearly harmless, palace servants were executed for imaginary conspiracies, while loyal supporters were eliminated based on dreams and omens that existed only in his mind. The emperor began making policy decisions based entirely on supernatural communications that were obviously products of his deteriorating mental state. He would claim to receive messages from gods that always coincidentally supported whatever he wanted to do at the moment. His physical appearance became increasingly bizarre, as he spent vast sums on elaborate costumes and theatrical props that he wore constantly. He would appear at government meetings dressed as Hercules, complete with fake muscles and lion skin, while demanding that everyone treat him as an actual god. The emperor's speech patterns became disconnected from reality. He would speak about his mythological adventures as if they were recent news, while referring to historical events as if they were fictional stories. His conversation became impossible to follow. His treatment of time and scheduling became completely arbitrary. He would declare that days had different numbers of hours, or that months should be longer or shorter, based on his current interests. The imperial calendar became meaningless. The emperor's approach to geography was equally detached from reality. He would rename cities, provinces, and entire regions based on his mythological fantasies, while insisting that these changes reflected actual transformations in the physical world. His financial decisions became so irrational that even his corrupt advisors couldn't implement them. He would order payments to mythological figures or demand that the treasury fund expeditions to fictional location. The emperor's military planning reached levels of absurdity that endangered the empire. He would order campaigns against imaginary enemies while ignoring real threats that were clearly visible to everyone except him. His approach to justice became completely random. He would pardon serious criminals because they reminded him of mythological characters while executing innocent people for failing to participate enthusiastically in his fantasies. The emperor's eating habits became ritualistic and bizarre. He would only consume foods that had been prepared according to mythological recipes, or that had symbolic significance for his current divine role. His sleeping patterns became completely erratic. He would stay awake for days, organizing elaborate performances, then sleep for extended periods while claiming to be receiving divine visions. The emperor's hygiene and self-care became neglected, as he became obsessed with maintaining his theatrical costumes and props, while ignoring basic personal maintenance. His approach to palace security became so extreme that it interfered with basic government functions. He would change security procedures multiple times per day, while requiring everyone to undergo elaborate clearance processes to enter his presence. The emperor's treatment of his own family became completely disconnected from normal human relationships. He would assign them roles in his mythological scenarios while seeming to forget their actual identity. His approach to communication became increasingly difficult to understand. He would speak in elaborate metaphors drawn from mythology while becoming angry when people couldn't follow his meaning. The emperor's physical coordination began to deteriorate, as he spent increasing amounts of time in elaborate costumes that restricted his movement, while performing demanding physical routines that exceeded his actual ability. His emotional regulation became completely unstable. He would shift rapidly between extreme moods, often triggered by minor events that others couldn't predict or understand. The emperor's decision-making process became so convoluted that simple choices required elaborate consultations with imaginary advisors and complex interpretations of meaningless omens. His approach to problem-solving became circular and ineffective. He would create elaborate solutions to problems that existed only in his imagination, while ignoring real issues that required immediate attention. The emperor's social skills deteriorated to the point where he could no longer maintain relationships, even with his closest supporters. His behavior became so unpredictable that people avoided him whenever possible. His sense of cause and effect became completely confused. He would expect impossible results from his decisions, while becoming angry when reality didn't conform to his expectation. The emperor's final weeks were characterized by increasingly desperate attempts to prove his divine nature through ever more elaborate and dangerous performances that risked not only his life, but the stability of the entire empire. On December 31st, 1902 AD, the inevitable finally happened. Conspiracy led by his own bodyguard and palace staff succeeded in assassinating the emperor, who had become too dangerous to allow to live. The man who had claimed to be Hercules died like any mortal, strangled in his bath by people who had finally decided that the empire's survival required his death. The assassination wasn't just the elimination of a tyrant, it was the end of a nightmare that had consumed the Roman Empire for 12 years. and nearly destroyed the greatest civilization the world had ever known. Commodus had transformed from emperor to monster to madman, and finally to corpse. His death was greeted with celebration throughout the empire, as people learned that their long nightmare was finally over, but the damage he had inflicted would take generations to repair, and some aspects of Roman civilization never fully recovered from his reign of terror. The story of Commodus serves as a timeless warning about what happens when absolute power is given to someone without the moral foundation or psychological stability to handle it responsibly. His reign demonstrates how quickly a great civilization can be corrupted when leadership fails. But the madness of Commodus didn't exist in a vacuum. It was enabled and supported by a system that had already been corrupted by previous emperors who had normalized many of the behaviors that he would take to their logical extreme. Behind every tyrant stands an army of enablers, people who make evil possible through their collaboration, silence, or active participation. Commodus didn't rule alone. He was supported by thousands of individuals who chose personal benefit over moral responsibility, creating a network of corruption that made his reign possible. His palace staff were the most intimate enablers, living daily with his madness, while helping to maintain the illusion that his behavior was acceptable. These servants, courtiers, and administrators witnessed his worst crimes while continuing to serve him faithfully. Many became complicit in his cruelty. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers responsible for protecting the emperor, gradually transformed from protectors into accomplices. They knew better than anyone how dangerous and unstable Commodus had become, yet they continued to follow his orders and eliminate his enemies until the very end. Roman senators who should have provided a check on imperial power instead became willing participants in his theatrical degradation. They paid enormous sums to watch him perform in the arena, participated in his humiliating ceremonies, and publicly praised his divine claims while privately despising claims. Wealthy Romans throughout the empire enabled his behavior by providing the financial resources that funded his excesses. They competed to offer him gifts, tribute, and entertainment while hoping to gain favor or avoid persecution. Their wealth made his fantasies possible. Provincial governors and military commanders carried out his bizarre orders without question, implementing policies that they knew were harmful to the empire. They prioritized their own careers over their responsibilities to the people they governed. The Roman people themselves bear some responsibility for enabling his reign by attending his gladiatorial performances, cheering his arena victories, and accepting his claims to divinity. They provided the audience that fed his narcissism and validated his delusions. Religious leaders throughout the empire compromised their spiritual authority by acknowledging his divine status and incorporating worship of him into traditional ceremonies. They traded their integrity for imperial favor while corrupting the religious foundations of Roman society. Artists, writers, and intellectuals enabled his propaganda machine by creating works that celebrated his achievements and divine nature. They abandoned their creative integrity to produce flattery disguised as art, while helping to spread his mythological claims. Foreign rulers and diplomats enabled his international humiliation by continuing to engage with Rome despite his bizarre behavior. They overlooked his obvious insanity in order to maintain trade relationships and avoid military conflicts. The psychological mechanisms that enabled collaboration with Commodus are familiar to anyone who has studied how normal people become complicit in evil systems. People rationalized their participation, convinced themselves that they had no alternatives, and gradually normalized behaviors that they initially found shocking. Many enablers genuinely believed that their individual participation didn't matter, or that they could somehow moderate his behavior from within the system. These rationalizations allowed them to maintain their self-respect while participating in increasingly horrible activity. Others were motivated by fear, knowing that opposition to Commodus meant death, while collaboration offered the possibility of survival and even prosperity. This rational calculation led many basically decent people to make choices that enabled evil. Some enablers were simply opportunists who saw his reign as a chance to advance their own interests regardless of the cost to others. These individuals actively promoted his worst impulses because they benefited from the chaos and corruption. The gradual nature of his descent into madness made it easier for people to become complicit. Each new outrage was only slightly worse than the previous one, allowing people to adjust incrementally to increasingly unacceptable behavior. Many enablers maintained elaborate mental defenses that allowed them to participate in evil while preserving their self-image as good people. They would focus on small acts of kindness while ignoring their larger participation in systematic cruelty. The social pressure to conform was enormous. Anyone who expressed doubt about the emperor's behavior risked being labeled as disloyal or treasonous. This pressure pushed even reluctant participants toward active collaboration. Economic incentives played a major role in creating enablers. Many people depended on the imperial system for their livelihoods and couldn't afford to lose their positions regardless of their moral qualms about the emperor's behavior. The compartmentalization of the imperial bureaucracy allowed people to focus on their narrow responsibilities while avoiding awareness of the larger system they were supporting. This division of labor made it easier for individuals to rationalize their participation. Perhaps most disturbingly, many enablers eventually came to genuinely admire Commodus and his behavior. The human capacity for adapting to abnormal situations is so great that people can learn to see evil as normal or even admirable. The legacy of Commodus's enablers is a reminder that evil requires collaboration to succeed, and that ordinary people have both the power and the responsibility to resist tyrants through their individual choices. While Commodus lived in luxury and fantasy, millions of ordinary Romans suffered under his reign, experiencing poverty, violence, and terror that destroyed their lives and communities. His victims weren't just the people he personally tortured or killed, but entire generations who lived under the shadow of his madness. The Roman people faced constant economic hardship as the emperor's spending drained the treasury and his policies destroyed trade and commerce. Families lost their savings to inflation while struggling to afford basic necessities like food and shelter. Ordinary citizens lived in fear of arbitrary persecution, knowing that any action or comment might be interpreted as disloyal to the emperor. People learned to watch their words carefully, avoid public gatherings, and maintain low profiles to avoid unwanted attention. Women throughout the empire faced particular dangers from an emperor who treated them as objects to be collected and displayed. Many families lived in terror that their daughters, wives, or sisters might attract the emperor's attention and be taken to serve in his collection. Children grew up in an environment of fear and instability where normal childhood development was impossible. They witnessed violence and degradation that traumatized them while learning that safety depended on absolute submission to authority. Military families suffered as professional soldiers were forced to abandon their duties and participate in theatrical performances, while frontier communities lost protection from barbarian raids. The emperor's military policies endangered everyone who depended on Roman defense. Farmers and rural communities faced increasing taxation and demands for tribute, while receiving less protection and fewer services from the imperial government. Their crops and livestock were often confiscated to feed the emperor's excesses. Urban residents dealt with deteriorating infrastructure and services as resources were diverted to fund the emperor's entertainment, while crime and violence increased due to the breakdown of law and order. Merchants and traders saw their businesses destroyed by the emperor's arbitrary policies and economic mismanagement. International trade declined while domestic commerce was disrupted by constant political instability. Artists and intellectuals faced censorship and persecution. If their work didn't celebrate the emperor's achievements, many fled the empire or abandoned their professions rather than produce propaganda. Religious communities were forced to compromise their beliefs and practices to accommodate the emperor's divine claims, while traditional ceremonies and festivals were corrupted or eliminated. Slaves and lower-class citizens experienced even worse treatment than usual, as the emperor's cruelty filtered down through all levels of society, creating an atmosphere where violence and exploitation were normalized. Provincial populations suffered under governors who were more interested in pleasing the emperor than governing effectively, while local traditions and customs were suppressed in favor of the imperial cult. Victims of the emperor's personal violence included not just direct targets but their families and communities who lived in fear of similar treatment. The psychological trauma extended far beyond the immediate victims. The economic victims of his reign included future generations who inherited a weakened empire, massive debts and damaged institutions that took decades to repair. Perhaps most tragically, many victims internalized their oppression and came to believe that they deserved their suffering. or that the emperor's behavior was somehow justified. This psychological damage was often more lasting than physical harm. The children who grew up during his reign were particularly damaged by their experiences. Many never learned normal social skills or developed healthy relationships, while others became perpetuators of the violence they had witnessed. Communities throughout the empire lost their social cohesion and trust as people learned to spy on their neighbors and compete for the emperor's favor rather than working together for common goals. The cultural victims of his reign included lost works of art, literature, and scholarship that were destroyed or never created due to his censorship and persecution of intellectual. Future victims included the generations of Romans who would suffer from the institutional damage and precedents established during his reign. His policies weakened the empire's ability to defend itself and govern effectively. The international victims included allied peoples who lost Roman protection and support, while enemy populations suffered from the aggressive wars launched to satisfy the emperor's ego. Perhaps most importantly, the victims of Commodus included the very concept of Roman virtue and civilization itself. His reign damaged the moral and cultural foundations that had made Rome great. The assassination of Commodus on December 31, 1902 AD, marked the end of his personal reign of terror, but the damage he had inflicted on the Roman Empire would continue to reverberate for generations. The immediate aftermath of his death revealed the full extent of the destruction he had caused. The Roman Senate immediately declared damnatio memoria against Commodus, ordering that his name be erased from inscriptions, his statues destroyed, and his official acts declared invalid. This systematic attempt to erase him from history reflected the depth of hatred and shame that Romans felt about his reign. The new emperor Pertinax faced the enormous task of trying to repair 12 years of damage with an empty treasury, a demoralized military, a corrupt administration, and a population that had lost faith in imperial authority. The challenges were so overwhelming that many wondered if the empire could survive. The economic situation was catastrophic. The imperial treasury was not just empty, but massively in debt, while the currency had been so debased that trade and commerce had largely collapsed back to barter systems. Pertinax attempted financial reforms, but the damage was too extensive for quick solutions. The military was in shambles, with discipline destroyed, morale at historic lows, and competent officers eliminated or marginalized. Barbarian tribes along the frontiers had observed Roman weakness and were preparing invasions that would exploit the empire's vulnerability. The administrative system was corrupted beyond easy repair, with incompetent appointees in key positions, records destroyed or falsified, and institutional knowledge lost. Many experienced administrators had fled or been killed, leaving crucial positions unfilled. The psychological damage to Roman society was perhaps the most severe. Citizens had learned to expect arbitrary violence, governmental incompetence, and economic instability, while losing faith in the traditional values that had held the empire together. The precedents established during Commodus's reign would influence future emperors, some of whom would adopt similar behaviors, while others would struggle to rebuild the authority and legitimacy that he had destroyed. The international consequences were equally severe. Rome's allies had lost confidence in imperial stability, while enemies had gained time to strengthen themselves and plan attacks. The diplomatic relationships that had taken centuries to build were damaged or destroyed. The cultural damage was immense. Works of art and literature had been destroyed or lost, while an entire generation of artists and intellectuals had been eliminated or silenced. The intellectual life of the empire would take decades to recover. The religious consequences included the corruption of traditional Roman religion and the establishment of imperial cult practices that would influence later developments in emperor worship. Perhaps most tragically, the reign of Commodus demonstrated that the Roman system was vulnerable to complete corruption by a single individual. The constitutional safeguards that were supposed to prevent tyranny had proven inadequate. When faced with someone willing to ignore all traditional constraint, the immediate successors of Commodus faced the challenge of restoring legitimacy to an institution that had been thoroughly discredited. Pertinax ruled for only 87 days before being assassinated by the same Praetorian Guard that had killed Commodus. The year of the 5 emperors that followed Commodus's death reflected the institutional damage he had caused as different factions fought for control of an empire that no longer had clear succession procedures or stable governance. The eventual stabilization under Septimius Severus required fundamental changes to the imperial system, including increased reliance on military force and reduced emphasis on traditional constitutional forms. The long-term consequences of Commodus's reign contributed to the gradual transformation of the Roman Empire from a republic in imperial disguise to an openly autocratic military state. The memory of his reign served as a cautionary tale for future generations, but also as a reminder of how quickly civilized society could collapse when leadership failed. The reign of Commodus offers timeless lessons about power corruption and the fragility of civilized society that remain relevant today. His story demonstrates how quickly institutions can be corrupted and how individual choices by ordinary people can enable or resist tyranny. The most obvious lesson is about the dangers of absolute power without checks and balances. Commodus's ability to act without constraint transformed him from a spoiled child into a monster who nearly destroyed an empire. His reign also illustrates how personal psychology and character matter in leadership positions. Technical competence and intelligence are insufficient if a leader lacks basic moral restraints and psychological stability. The role of enablers in his reign shows how evil requires collaboration to succeed, and how ordinary people become complicit in systems they initially oppose through gradual compromise and rationalization. The economic consequences of his misrule demonstrate how poor governance can destroy even the wealthiest societies through a combination of corruption, incompetence, and misplaced priority. His treatment of truth and reality offers lessons about the dangers of leaders who create alternative realities and demand that others participate in their delusions regardless of fact. The military aspects of his reign show how professional institutions can be corrupted when their primary loyalty shifts from their mission to the personal whims of leaders. His approach to international relations demonstrates how erratic leadership can destroy diplomatic relationships and strategic alliances that took generations to build. The cultural destruction during his reign illustrates how quickly intellectual and artistic achievement can be lost when censorship and persecution replace genuine patronage and support. His religious innovations show how spiritual authority can be corrupted and manipulated for political purposes while traditional beliefs are subordinated to personal power. The psychological damage inflicted on his subjects demonstrates the long-term consequences of living under tyrannical rule and how trauma can be transmitted across generations. His reign also offers lessons about resistance and the importance of maintaining moral standards even under extreme pressure, while showing how individual conscience can eventually triumph over systematic evil. The aftermath of his rule illustrates both the possibility of recovery from tyranny and the long-term damage that corrupt leadership can inflict on institutions and society. Perhaps most importantly, his story serves as a reminder that the foundations of civilized society are more fragile than they appear and require constant vigilance and active protection by citizens. The parallels between his behavior and that of modern tyrants demonstrate that the fundamental patterns of corruption and abuse remain consistent across time and cultures. His reign also shows how quickly societies can normalize extreme behavior and how important it is to resist the gradual erosion of standards and expectation. The role of entertainment and spectacle in his rule offers lessons about how leaders can use distraction and bread and circuses to maintain power while avoiding accountability. His economic policies demonstrate how short-term thinking and personal benefit can destroy long-term prosperity and stability. The international consequences of his reign show how domestic tyranny inevitably affects relationships with other nations and can damage a country's standing in the world. His treatment of truth and facts illustrates the dangers of post-truth politics, where reality becomes subordinate to personal or political narrative. Perhaps most relevantly, his story demonstrates that institutions and constitutional safeguards are only as strong as the people who operate them, and that formal rules cannot protect society from leaders who are willing to ignore all constraint. Understanding Commodus requires examining the psychological factors that transformed him from a privileged child into history's most depraved ruler. His mental state reveals patterns that help explain how power corruption and personality disorders can combine to create monsters. His narcissistic personality disorder was evident from early childhood through his inability to form genuine relationships, his need for constant admiration, and his belief that normal rules didn't apply to him. These traits were exacerbated by unlimited power and constant flattery. His complete lack of empathy was perhaps his most dangerous characteristic. He seemed incapable of understanding that other people experienced pain, fear, or any emotions that might complicate his own desires. This emotional blindness made cruelty easy for him. His grandiose delusions evolved from simple arrogance to complete breaks with reality, as he began to genuinely believe that he was divine and that his fantasies were historical facts. This progression shows how unchecked narcissism can develop into full psychosis. His need for constant stimulation and novelty drove him to increasingly extreme behaviors as normal experiences lost their ability to satisfy him. This pattern is common among individuals with certain personality disorders who require ever greater thrills to feel alive. His paranoid tendencies developed as his behavior created real enemies, leading to a cycle where his fear of opposition justified increasingly oppressive measures, which created more opposition and greater fear. His inability to distinguish between performance and reality reflected a fundamental confusion about his own identity. He lived so completely in his fantasies that he lost touch with any authentic sense of self. His treatment of relationships as collections rather than connections reveals his inability to see other people as independent beings with their own rights and desires. He could only understand others in terms of their usefulness to him. His obsession with control extended to every aspect of his environment as he tried to force reality to conform to his wishes. This need for absolute control is common among individuals who feel fundamentally insecure despite their outward confidence. His violent responses to any form of resistance or criticism show how fragile his self-image actually was beneath the grandiose exterior. He was deeply insecure and responded to any threat to his ego with disproportionate rage. His regression into increasingly childish behaviors under stress demonstrates how his emotional development had been stunted by privilege and power. He never learned to cope with frustration or disappointment in healthy ways. His sexual behavior reflected his need to dominate and possess rather than any genuine intimacy or pleasure. He used sexuality as another tool for control and humiliation rather than human connection. His relationship with truth was purely instrumental. He would believe or promote whatever served his immediate interests without any concern for accuracy or consistency. This flexibility with facts allowed him to maintain his delusions. His fear of aging and mortality drove many of his most extreme behaviors as he tried to prove his divine nature and ensure his immortality through increasingly desperate and elaborate performances. His inability to learn from experience meant that he repeated the same destructive patterns throughout his reign without ever developing insight into their consequences. His treatment of his own body as a theatrical prop reveals his disconnection from physical reality and his inability to distinguish between his actual self and his performed persona. Perhaps most tragically, his complete isolation from authentic human connection meant that he lived his entire adult life in a psychological prison of his own making, surrounded by people but fundamentally alone. Modern psychiatric analysis would likely identify multiple overlapping conditions, including narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and possibly bipolar disorder or other mood disorders that were exacerbated by his circumstances. His case demonstrates how power can amplify existing psychological problems by removing the external constraints that might otherwise force someone to confront their issues and develop coping strategies. The progression of his mental deterioration over 12 years shows how untreated psychological problems can worsen over time, especially when the individual is enabled and encouraged rather than challenged. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of psychological screening for leaders and the dangers of placing unstable individuals in positions of absolute authority. Understanding his psychology doesn't excuse his behavior, but it does help explain how someone could systematically destroy one of history's greatest civilizations while believing himself to be a divine hero. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of studying Commodus isn't his individual madness. It's how his reign reveals the fundamental weaknesses in human nature and political systems that allowed such a monster to gain and maintain power for over a decade. The Roman Empire wasn't destroyed by Commodus alone. It was destroyed by a system that had gradually evolved to enable and protect exactly the kind of tyrant it was designed to prevent. His reign exposed the fundamental flaws in imperial governance that had been building for generations. Succession system that brought him to power was inherently problematic. Marcus Aurelius's decision to name his biological son as heir rather than adopting the most qualified candidate broke with the adoptive principle that had given Rome its greatest emperors. This single decision opened the door to hereditary tyranny. The Praetorian Guard, which was supposed to protect good emperors and eliminate bad ones, had become corrupted by bribes and personal loyalty rather than serving the empire's interests. They enabled Commodus's worst behavior, while eliminating anyone who might have stopped him. The Roman Senate, which retained theoretical authority to check imperial power, had been so weakened by previous emperors that it could only survive through submission and flattery. Senators who might have provided wise counsel instead became enablers and accomplices. The imperial bureaucracy that managed the day-to-day operations of government had evolved into a system where personal loyalty to the emperor was more important than competence or integrity. This created an administration that would implement any order regardless of its wisdom or legality. The military command structure that should have prioritized the empire's security instead became focused on pleasing the emperor and advancing personal careers rather than maintaining professional standards or strategic effectiveness. The legal system that was supposed to protect citizens from arbitrary power had been corrupted to serve imperial whims rather than justice, making it impossible for anyone to seek protection from the emperor's excesses. The economic system that supported the empire's wealth and power had become dependent on imperial spending and favor creating incentives for people to enable wasteful and destructive policies rather than promoting sound financial management. The religious establishment that might have provided moral guidance instead became a tool for legitimizing imperial power, while abandoning its responsibility to speak truth to authority. The intellectual community that could have offered alternative perspectives and critical analysis was silenced through censorship and persecution, while only sycophantic propaganda was permitted. The provincial governance system that managed the empire's vast territories became focused on extracting tribute for the emperor's personal use rather than promoting prosperity and stability in the regions. The diplomatic apparatus that managed relationships with foreign powers became an extension of the emperor's ego rather than a tool for advancing Roman interests, creating enemies and undermining alliances. The information systems that should have provided accurate intelligence about threats and opportunities instead became echo chambers that told the emperor only what he wanted to hear. The financial oversight mechanisms that were supposed to prevent waste and corruption became tools for enabling imperial excess while hiding the true costs of destructive policies. The cultural institutions that preserved and transmitted Roman values became propaganda machines that celebrated vice while abandoning the moral foundations of civilization. Perhaps most critically, the constitutional principles that were supposed to limit imperial power had eroded so completely that they existed only on paper while providing no real protection against tyranny. The checks and balances that theoretically constrained emperors had been systematically weakened by previous rulers who found them inconvenient until they existed only as historical memories. The informal traditions and customs that had once provided moral guidance for leaders had been abandoned in favor of unlimited personal freedom for those in power. The social institutions that might have provided alternative sources of authority and legitimacy had been co-opted or destroyed, leaving the emperor as the only significant power center. The educational system that should have prepared future leaders with wisdom and virtue instead focused on technical skills and personal advancement, while neglecting moral development. The communication networks that could have coordinated resistance or reform instead became tools for surveillance and control, making opposition increasingly difficult and dangerous. The economic incentives that drove individual behavior had been distorted to reward collaboration with tyranny, while punishing virtue and independence. The psychological environment created by the system encouraged conformity and submission, while discouraging independent thought and moral courage. The legal protections that might have shielded dissent and opposition had been eliminated or perverted to serve the interests of those in power. The international relationships that could have provided external pressure for reform instead became sources of validation and support for the emperor's behavior. The historical record that might have provided lessons and warnings was systematically falsified to support imperial propaganda, while suppressing uncomfortable truths. The technological capabilities that could have improved governance and communication were instead used primarily for entertainment and control. The intellectual frameworks that might have provided alternative models of leadership and governance were suppressed in favor of imperial mythology and personality cult. The moral traditions that had once constrained the behavior of leaders were abandoned in favor of unlimited indulgence and self-gratification. Commodus didn't emerge from a vacuum. His reign was the logical culmination of trends that had been developing in Roman society for over a century. The transformation of Rome from republic to empire had created conditions that made his tyranny almost inevitable. The gradual concentration of power in the imperial office had eliminated most of the republican institutions that might have provided checks on imperial authority. By the time Commodus inherited power, the emperor was already effectively absolute. The corruption of Roman values had been proceeding for generations as wealth and power replaced virtue and public service as the primary goals of the elite. The moral foundations that had made Rome great were already severely weakened. The militarization of Roman society had created a culture where violence was increasingly seen as the solution to political problems. while civilian virtues like law and diplomacy were devalued. The growth of luxury and decadence among the wealthy had normalized excess and self-indulgence while creating expectations that those in power should be able to satisfy any desire. The expansion of slavery had dehumanized large portions of the population while teaching the elite to view other people as objects to be owned and used rather than fellow human beings. The religious changes that had introduced foreign cults and emperor worship had weakened traditional Roman religious values while creating precedents for treating humans as divine. The economic inequality that had developed between rich and poor had created a society where most people were desperate for survival while a small elite lived in unprecedented luxury. The breakdown of traditional family structures among the elite had eliminated many of the informal constraints that had once limited the behavior of those in power. The influence of Greek culture and philosophy had introduced ideas about absolute monarchy and divine kingship that conflicted with traditional Roman republican values. The constant warfare that had expanded the empire had brutalized Roman society while creating a culture that celebrated violence and domination. The administrative demands of governing a vast empire had created bureaucratic systems that prioritized efficiency over accountability while reducing citizens to subjects. The technological advances that had improved Roman military and engineering capabilities had also made it easier for those in power to control and oppress large population. The cultural syncretism that had absorbed influences from conquered peoples had weakened distinctive Roman identity while creating confusion about fundamental values. The educational changes that had emphasized Greek rhetoric and philosophy over traditional Roman virtues had produced generations of leaders who were skilled in manipulation but lacking in character. The legal developments that had concentrated judicial power in imperial courts had undermined the rule of law, while making justice dependent on imperial favor. The economic policies that had favored urban populations over rural communities had created demographic imbalances, while weakening the agricultural foundation of Roman prosperity. The diplomatic practices that had treated foreign peoples as inferiors rather than potential partners had created enemies while undermining the soft power that had once supported Roman influence. The architectural and artistic developments that emphasized grandiosity over functionality had reflected and reinforced values that prioritized appearance over substance. The literary and intellectual trends that had moved away from civic engagement toward personal pleasure and philosophical speculation had weakened the cultural foundations of republican government. The social customs that had once enforced moral behavior through public shame and honor had been replaced by systems that rewarded wealth and power, regardless of how they were obtained. The political traditions that had balanced different interests and constituencies had been replaced by systems that concentrated power while eliminating meaningful opposition. The psychological changes that had accompanied the transition from citizen to subject had created populations that were more willing to accept tyranny in exchange for security and entertainment. The damage caused by Commodus extended far beyond his personal crimes, or even the direct suffering of his immediate victims. His reign created precedents and patterns that would influence Roman history for centuries, while demonstrating how one individual's evil can corrupt entire civilization. Future emperors learned from his example that they could ignore traditional constraints and pursue personal gratification without necessarily facing immediate consequences. This lesson encouraged increasingly autocratic behavior among his successors. The institutional damage he caused weakened the empire's ability to respond effectively to future crises, as competent administrators had been eliminated and effective procedures had been abandoned. The economic destruction he caused reduced the empire's resources while creating debts and obligations that burdened future generations who had to choose between essential services and debt payments. The military damage he inflicted left the empire vulnerable to foreign invasion, while destroying the professional culture that had made Roman armies effective. The diplomatic isolation he created made it more difficult for future emperors to build the alliances and relationships necessary for effective foreign policy. The cultural destruction he caused eliminated much of the intellectual and artistic heritage that had made Roman civilization distinctive while creating gaps in knowledge that were never fully recovered. The religious corruption he introduced established precedents for emperor worship and political manipulation of spiritual authority that would influence later developments in imperial ideology. The legal precedents he established weakened the rule of law, while creating expectations that justice should serve political rather than moral purposes. The social divisions he created or exacerbated made it more difficult for future leaders to build the consensus necessary for effective governance. The psychological trauma he inflicted on Roman society created generations of people who were suspicious of authority, while being unable to imagine alternatives to imperial rule. The international reputation damage he caused made other nations less willing to trust Roman commitments or engage in long-term relationships with the empire. The technological stagnation that resulted from his misallocation of resources slowed innovation while reducing the empire's competitive advantages. The demographic changes that resulted from his policies, including emigration and reduced birth rates, weakened the human foundation of Roman power. The environmental damage caused by his wasteful use of natural resources reduced the empire's long-term sustainability while creating shortages that affected future generations. The educational damage he caused by persecuting intellectuals and corrupting schools created knowledge gaps that weakened the empire's administrative and technical capability. The moral corruption he promoted by rewarding vice and punishing virtue created cultural patterns that made it more difficult for future generations to maintain civilized behavior. The precedent he established for using entertainment and spectacle to distract from political problems became a standard tool for later tyrants seeking to avoid accountability. The normalization of extreme behavior that occurred during his reign raised the threshold for what people considered shocking or unacceptable, making future abuses easier to implement. The breakdown of institutional loyalty he caused made it more difficult for future emperors to count on the support of traditional power centers like the Senate or military. The economic policies he implemented created structural problems that required decades to resolve, while establishing patterns of fiscal irresponsibility that influenced later emperors. The foreign policy disasters he caused created enemies and lost opportunities that continued to affect Roman strategic position long after his death. The urban planning and infrastructure neglect that characterized his reign created physical problems that reduced the quality of life for ordinary Romans while increasing the cost of future improvement. The legal corruption he promoted created expectations that law should serve power rather than justice, making it more difficult to establish fair and effective governance. The artistic and intellectual censorship he imposed created cultural gaps while establishing patterns of state control over creative expression that influenced later periods. Perhaps most significantly, the example he provided of how power could be abused established a template that future tyrants could follow, while demonstrating the vulnerability of seemingly strong institutions. His reign proved that even the most powerful and sophisticated civilization could be destroyed by individual evil when supported by systematic corruption and enabled by widespread complicity. The memory of his reign served as both a warning and an inspiration depending on the audience. Some learned to fear and oppose tyranny, while others learned how to implement it more effectively. The historical accounts of his behavior became sources of both condemnation and instruction. As later generations struggled to understand how such evil could have been possible, the archaeological evidence of his reign, including destroyed buildings, altered inscriptions, and modified artworks, continues to remind us of the physical reality of his destructive impact. The literary and historical treatments of his reign have influenced how subsequent generations understand the relationship between power and morality, while providing lessons about the importance of institutional safeguard. The reign of Commodus offers insights that transcend the specific circumstances of ancient Rome, providing universal lessons about human nature, political systems, and the conditions that enable or prevent tyranny. His story demonstrates that individual character matters enormously in positions of power, and that technical competence cannot substitute for moral integrity. When someone has the ability to affect millions of lives, the role of enablers in his reign shows how evil requires collaboration to succeed, and how ordinary people become complicit through small compromises that gradually normalize unacceptable behavior. The systematic nature of the corruption during his reign illustrates how institutional safeguards can be undermined through persistent pressure, and how formal rules provide limited protection without informal enforcement. The economic consequences of his misrule demonstrate how poor governance can destroy even the wealthiest societies through a combination of waste, corruption, and misplaced priority. His manipulation of truth and reality offers lessons about the dangers of post-truth politics, where facts become subordinate to personal or political narratives. The psychological mechanisms that enabled his behavior provide insights into how power can corrupt, while demonstrating the importance of maintaining checks on those who hold authority. The international consequences of his reign show how domestic tyranny inevitably affects relationships with other nations, while damaging a country's reputation and strategic position. The cultural destruction during his rule illustrates how quickly intellectual and artistic achievement can be lost when censorship and persecution replace genuine support for creativity and learning. His treatment of the military demonstrates how professional institutions can be corrupted when their loyalty is redirected from their mission to the personal interests of leaders. The religious aspects of his reign show how spiritual authority can be manipulated for political purposes, while traditional beliefs are subordinated to the demands of power. The social changes that occurred during his rule reveal how quickly civilized behavior can deteriorate when moral leadership fails and vice is rewarded, while virtue is punished. The long-term consequences of his reign demonstrate that the damage caused by tyranny extends far beyond the immediate victims, affecting future generations who must live with the institutional and cultural destruction. The resistance that eventually emerged against him shows that even the most powerful tyrants ultimately depend on the consent of those they rule, and that this consent can be withdrawn when conditions become unbearable. The aftermath of his reign illustrates both the possibility of recovery from tyranny and the difficulty of rebuilding institutions and relationships that have been systematically destroyed. His psychological profile provides insights into the types of personality disorders that are particularly dangerous when combined with unlimited power, while demonstrating the importance of psychological evaluation for leaders. The enabling factors that made his reign possible offer lessons about the social and political conditions that increase the risk of tyranny, while suggesting preventive measures. The victims of his reign remind us that the human cost of political failure is measured not just in statistics but in individual lives destroyed and communities traumatized. The historical context of his rise shows how seemingly stable societies can become vulnerable to tyranny through gradual erosion of norms and institution. The systemic failures that enabled his behavior demonstrate that preventing tyranny requires more than good intentions. It requires active vigilance and institutional design that anticipates and prevents abuse. Perhaps most importantly, his story serves as a reminder that the choice between civilization and barbarism is one that every generation must make anew, and that freedom requires eternal vigilance. Sweet dreams, and remember that in studying the darkest chapters of human history, we learn not just about the capacity for evil, but about the preciousness of the freedoms and institutions that protect us from such horrors. The story of Commodus is ultimately a story about choices: the choice to enable or resist, the choice to collaborate or oppose, the choice to remain silent or speak truth to power, and the choice to learn from history or be doomed to repeat it.